Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell. Miranda Bracker turned down the street into the yard of her house and was immediately sent sideways in horror. A huge black Jeep was coming at her down the narrow driveway, diesel fuel blistering unbearably. Another second, and the woman would have been under its wheels, but she managed to dodge and jump the curb. A bald-faced gape face in dark glasses sat behind the wheel of the car. This jump seemed to cheer him up a lot. He laughed happily, pointing his passenger's hand somewhere in the direction of Miranda, and a couple of times on cue, apparently to humiliate the old woman. Scare the old woman, Miranda thought. Stop. What old woman? You can't think of yourself like that, or you'll turn around before you can turn into a hunchbacked, ungroomed hockey stick, barely able to move your feet. Just a woman of venerable age, and she's a mirror of herself. Bracker really didn't look like an old woman. A slender, short, older woman. She'd only retired 3 years ago and had taken great care of herself. Covering up her gray hair, did discreet makeup, kept her back straight, wore hats and elegant suits always, even if, like today, she was just going grocery shopping. She was firmly convinced that a woman must look dignified in any situation, and all her life she had built her entire demeanor on that conviction. A hasty jump on the curb did not fit into her model of dignified behavior. Therefore, the episode with the Jeep made Miranda quite angry, plus from the sudden movement. A dull pain appeared in her right side, and her heart rolled like crazy. The woman decided to take a little break on a bench in the backyard backdrop and catch her breath before heading up to her apartment, inevitably approaching the policy. However, Bracker grumbled to himself. God gave new neighbors, one worse than the other. That thug in the Jeep had just moved in, and already he was a nuisance. What kind of house was it? What kind of house? The house Miranda lived in most of her life was really not bad. It was considered high-end in its day. High ceilings, well-designed apartments, quiet entrances, just a couple of apartments per floor, a wide courtyard with a paratrooper and a children's corner. And all this is a stone's throw from the city center. But at a distance from the noisy thoroughfares, all the conditions for a decent life. The house was under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Education, and the apartment in it was allocated exclusively to the institute workers. And not easy. Prominent scientists, professors, honored worker of science, academician. Miranda herself, although she was a candidate of philological sciences, would hardly have managed to get into this branch of scientific Olympus. But her husband was head of the physics department. He made a certain discovery, significant for the Soviet industry, and for this he was awarded an apartment in an elite house. All her life, Bracker was proud of her residence and her surroundings. But in the last few years, pride has been slowly replaced by irritation and regret. After the collapse of the Union, the population of the house began to renew itself rapidly. Researchers were selling their apartments. Some moved to simpler housing, expecting the difference between the sale and purchase to provide a decent life for themselves in retirement. Some went to the suburbs, deciding to spend their old age in nature, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. Some of the neighbors died, and the apartments were sold by their heirs, to whom it was simply unprofitable to maintain such expensive housing. Oh, those heirs. Their behavior invariably upset Bracker. They sold off the old and even antique furniture from the apartments for next to nothing. They sacked the books that their parents and grandparents had collected all their lives. They piled up by the dumpsters reproductions of paintings and porcelain sets, calling it all unnecessary junk. And these are the descendants of educated, intelligent people who received not the worst education and upbringing. Miranda refused to believe it. Year after year, gradually the house was filled with nouveau riche in turnover, with chips chipped their capitals. At the beginning of perestroika, on the sale of everything that people were willing to buy. A couple of apartments were occupied by obvious gangsters. Take this guy in a Jeep, constantly blocking their iron monsters. The approach to the square. Smells like diesel all over the yard. There's a strange-looking girl in the next doorway. She's some new businessman's keeper. Several times a week she invited guests and threw parties, after which boxes of empty bottles were brought out of the entrance. The parties were invariably accompanied by loud music and dancing. The noise from the girl's open windows could be heard all over the yard. Bracker wondered with horror how the neighbors across the wall and downstairs tolerated it. But the worst of all, of course, was the lady who lived on the same lot with Miranda. "Good morning." Cindy Bracker lowered herself onto the bench where her neighbor, practically the last of the old guard of tenants, was already sitting. Kind Miranda responded, "I see you miraculously avoided being involved in a traffic accident. Did you see that? You have to admit, it's unbearable." The women had some fun washing the new tenant's bones for a while. Miranda learned that the fifth apartment had recently been moved into by another businessman. And that upset her, because it meant that the house was in for another round of renovations. Noise of speakers, dust around the entrance from construction materials, shouting workers and other inconveniences. Then smoothly moved to a discussion of prices and assortment in the nearest stores. They agreed that there was no worthy tea to be found nowadays, and meat was being charged at a completely obscene price. Cindy mentioned that she was going to go shopping at the wholesale store the other day, and Bracker ordered her a box of frozen hams. Miranda herself, traveling like that was beyond her capabilities, and taking the shopping on public transportation was awful, heavy, and uncomfortable. But Cindy and her husband had a car, and they had no trouble. Taking a breath, Bracker was about to go home, but then her companion nodded toward the yard and said mockingly, "Look, our blessed ethics are coming." Miranda turned her head and barely managed to restrain herself from making a disgruntled grimace at her new neighbor in the middle of the yard. Kelly, from Bracker's point of view, was the very old woman Miranda was so afraid of turning into. Complete with a former face slit with deep wrinkles and large, ungroomed hands covered in pigment stains. A trial of subterfuge. She moved leisurely, shifting her feet heavily. Her hair, once dewy, it was abundant with gray to cover the gray that her neighbor refused. She twisted her braid into an old plait at the back of her head, wore an Olympic dress from the nearest clothing market, and heavy square-toed shoes. With her, she always carried a bulky turbo bag that could hold anything, from a water bottle to wool socks to pills for any ailment. But there was something else. Miranda's annoyance was much stronger than her appearance. Kelly was an orderly. She told Bracker, in her ingenuous way, when she came to meet her the day after she moved in. "I can do anything," said the neighbor, smiling, a little embarrassed. "I can give injections and give drips. I learned while I was working at the hospital. Clara is my grandmother. She was my mom. She always told me to go and study. You'll become a doctor or at least a nurse." "What about you?" Miranda asked. I wrinkled my nose at the word mom. "Where can I go?" Waved his hand interlocutor. "First, the children were small. Then my husband got sick. He was very ill. I had to take care of him. And then she got sick. I was proving her. And then the age where after 40 to study. So I've been nursing all my life. Now I'm retired." Such a neighborhood. Miranda, accustomed to the circle of scientists, professors, and academicians, couldn't bear it. For her, it was the strongest blow to her self-esteem. It was also depressing that Kelly's apartment had not been purchased by her sons. New businessmen rose just on the resale of clothing and industrial goods. Bracker disliked and even despised peddlers. And if these peddlers also regularly visited her mother herself or accompanied by wives and grandchildren, it was all the more offensive. The only daughter, Miranda, whom the woman brought up in the best traditions of scientific intelligentsia, who put her heart and soul into it. She ran away from home at 18, married some construction worker. She'd rarely seen her mother since then. Bracker sometimes talked to Christina on the phone and knew that she had finished accounting courses and had set up a firm with her single husband. She made repairs to the newly rich and counted the profits, looked for clients, and was very proud of her business. But Christina did not want to communicate with her mother or help her with money. recognized that some nurse managed to raise children more successfully than she did. Miranda herself, a candidate of science, a specialist with higher education, was unpleasant, so she reduced communication with her neighbor to a minimum, never visited her, despite frequent invitations. She spoke to the woman coldly and almost condescendingly, never letting her pass the threshold. If Kelly tried to visit her, Bissett was not supportive, and unless it was necessary to discuss a business matter, quickly turned the meeting and left. Kelly, however, in a friend did not particularly achieve. With all the residents of the house, she communicated smoothly and friendly, maintaining good neighborly relations with Dubrovskaya. She politely greeted at meetings, interchange a couple of duty phrases about the weather and well-being. Sometimes she bragged about a new book, bought, as Miranda suspected, at the station's tray. The neighbor adored ladies' novels and soft-colored covers, and every time fervently recommended them to others with phrases, "So interesting everything is like in life." Bracker turned away from this delight. A couple of times she expressed to her neighbor her opinion about such literature. Lissa took offense, but stopped bragging about books. In principle, if we kept communication to a minimum, the nurse's neighborhood could be survived, if it were not for one thing. Kelly was a crazy Friday from Bracker's point of view. She didn't have a single cat living in her apartment, thank God, but she was actively feeding all the yard and street fleas. Twice a day, she brought them a pot of her own cooked porridge. In addition, she bought her charges some pills and drops, dragged them to the vet, treated sick cats, arranging them a hospital at home, delivered babies, and put in good hands kittens. Cindy once asked her how much money her neighbor spent on the cats and dumps each month, and when she found out the amount, she called her blessed. It turned out that the nurse spent more than half of her pension on her hobby. Twice a week, Kelly gave her charges fish days and cooked them porridge. With mine, the nasty fishy smell filled the entire entryway and concentrated as much as possible on the landing where Miranda lived. It seeped under the apartment door and seemed to spread all over the apartment, all the rooms. Bracker, it made her sick. She tried several times to talk to her neighbor about it, but hadn't succeeded. "Why are you doing these culinary experiments?" she asked indignantly. "Feed your tail something. There's ready-made food now. Why are you freaking out, Kelly?" I looked into it. These foods can be harmful to cats, especially street cats. They get used to it, and then they won't eat regular food. And not forever. If something happens to me, the animals will have to fend for themselves. They won't find food anywhere. They'll starve to death. No, Miranda, I can't take that risk. I'm feeding it according to the vet's recommendations. Well, at least replace it with some other fish. I was ready to give up. It stinks to high heaven. What else was Kelly surprised about? It's the cheapest. I take pollock, of course, but it's more expensive with my pension. I can't afford it for this many animals. That was usually the end of the conversation. Twice a week, Bracker suffered from the intrusive smell, and all the other days she tried to run into her neighbor less often, so as not to spoil her mood. And so today she didn't return from her encounter. The nasty attendant was acting out across the yard in the direction of the neighbors, carrying the gray, shaggy cat in her arms. Her witches were sprinkled about her. "Good afternoon, Kelly." Cindy said hello. "What have you got there?" "Good afternoon." The nurse said hello. "It's Grandma Bede. I'm taking her home. Today we'll pray and clean up her hair, and tomorrow we'll go to the vet. It's time for her to be sterilized when she grows up." "Sterilize her? Why?" Cindy was surprised. "Well, otherwise she breeds kittens, and then where to put them? Not to drown them. It's better this way. And a stylized one is easier to put down," Kelly said reasonably. "Makes sense." Suddenly, Miranda, "All we need is a bunch of kittens in our yard." "That's what I think," nodded Miranda. "You're all right. What do you look like?" "You don't look well. You're all yellow." Bracker resented the manners of pointing out the appearance of the person she was talking to. What do you expect from an uneducated nurse? The goose cat curled up in the woman's arms and she hurried away. Come on, we'll have a good day. Yes, Miranda. Do you stop by if you need anything? I've got some good bile stasis pills. Imported. The neighbor disappeared into the entrance. Cindy looked at her friend and grinned. Look, she didn't like the ethics as you answered to your greed. Our blessed one. To hint at something, you need to have at least a minimum of intelligence, Miranda said sternly. To sense your interlocutor, to anticipate his reactions. Kelly, it's unavailable. Just talking nonsense. And Bracker went home. There was still a tugging in her right side. Maybe it really is biliary. I should get a checkup. Have a checkup. Miranda had not looked at the polyclinic for a long time, believing that only old men and women go to doctors. But the pains in Baku were becoming more and more intrusive, and she decided to go right next week. And I'll go, she thought. In the morning, the smell of boiled My Thursday fish day crept from under the door. Miranda remembered with distaste. The woman looked at the clock, 6 o'clock, and the blissful nurse was already up, and she's keeping her awake too. She closed the bedroom door tightly, but the intrusive odor didn't go away. She had to get out of bed and start a new day. The whole apartment seemed to smell of fish, shampoos, toothpaste, freshly brewed coffee, and an orange muffin bought yesterday at the bakery next door. Bracker opened the window to air out the kitchen, but immediately got a handful of sand in her face. It was a windy day. The air was swirling. The dust lifted from the sidewalks instantly rushed into the apartment and sat on the windowsill and tables. Miranda slammed the frame shut irritably. Better an odor than a kitchen full of sand, she reasoned. No fun at all. I'm off to breakfast. Miranda decided to call her daughter. The last time she had spoken to Christina was over a month ago. Her daughter had never called her, and catching her on the phone was a problem. Most of the time, when the Brackers called her home, Christina was either at work or resting afterward. But Mom, she resented Miranda when she complained about her infrequent contacts. I leave for work at 8 o'clock, and I get there late in the evening, and I don't have time to talk. I'm on the phone all day with clients as it is. It's a business, you know. You can't let it get away from you. Miranda understood, although she was a little surprised that even on weekends she couldn't get her daughter on the phone. It was usually the son-in-law or the grandchildren and son-in-law who answered the phone. The woman did not like to talk, believing that the builder of the department apprentice as an interlocutor does not correspond to her. With grandchildren, on the contrary, was not averse to chat. But the boys didn't want to talk to their grandmother. Mom, no. I'll tell them you called while they were talking fast. They'd hang up. Christina never tried calling before work. She usually woke up around 9 o'clock, when her daughter had already left the office. But since she had to wake up earlier today, why not try it? Miranda resolutely motioned her phone to her and dialed the number. Hello, came the joyful voice of her daughter in the receiver. It hasn't been 2 years, Miranda thought. Hello, Christina, daughter. Hello, Mom. It's you. The voice became surprised and a little angry. What are you doing up so early? I just woke up and thought I'd call you before you went to work. I haven't heard from you in a while. I woke up at 700. My daughter was obviously surprised. Why all of a sudden? It's not like you've already gotten senile insomnia. That's a little early. Christina giggled. Miranda frowned. She couldn't stand any hint of her age. Actually, you caught me on the doorstep, didn't you? Christina continued. I'm already running away. Christina, but wait, at least 5 minutes. Bracker was indignant. It's been over a month since we last spoke. I don't know at all how you're doing, if you're all right as boys. How can you do that? But Mom angrily stretched out her daughter. Everything's fine. We don't have any special news. Rick and I are all up and running. It's the season, summer. Everyone's doing repairs, and we're helping them as much as we can for a modest fee. Christina giggled again. The boys finished the year well. Now they are visiting their mother-in-law. It was the message of the king that kicked Miranda. She had suggested more than once that Christina bring her grandchildren to her on weekends or vacations. The woman thought that it was time to begin to deal with upbringing and education in earnest, so that the boys would grow up something good. Since the parents devote all their time to work, it is logical that the grandmother should do it. But the daughter and son-in-law constantly rejected her suggestions. The boys are still young. I do not want to send them with a sleepover in an unfamiliar environment. They make noise and will disturb the grandmother. Parents themselves want to spend more time with their sons. And then, hello, they're visiting their mother-in-law. And what can the mother-in-law give them? A woman who barely graduated from the chef's college and worked in the factory canteen all her life. "Christina, why didn't you send them to me?" asked Bracker. "I want to see them too. And they won't be any worse off at my place. Come on, when they get here from my mother-in-law's. Pack them up to come visit me." "Mom, the boys are gone for the summer," Christina said angrily. "Mom has a private house near the river, the farm. The boys have a place to walk and something to do. They like it there. She feeds them. She spoils them with goodies. After last summer, not a day went by that they didn't ask their grandmother for a visit. You have an apartment in the center of town. Dust, noise, tight courtyard, and no ecology. But what are you talking about?" Last summer stunned at Miranda's thinking. I mean, they were already there last summer, and I was fed stories and excuses. Wonderful. Christina, don't you think? She started out stern, but her daughter interrupted her. "Mom, I gotta get out of here. There's Rick waving his car keys. Call me if you need anything." Christina hung up without waiting for an answer. Bracker listened to the dial tone for a moment and gently lowered the receiver of her phone to the lever. Is that how it is? They don't give her grandchildren. They cheat her brazenly. Conversations are turned away from her. Her daughter didn't even find it necessary to ask her how she was doing. No health problems. Does she need financial help? That's all I could think of. What about the insomnia joke? What kind of stale hulk grew on her wonderful girl? No, you can't think like that. And Miranda held her own. She just called at the wrong time. Christina was in a hurry, so she didn't have time to ask anything. And she didn't tell her grandchildren so as not to upset her mother. But in fact, if you compare, the private house of her mother-in-law is a much better place for the boys than her city apartment. Bracker diligently chased the bad thoughts away from her, though deep down she realized that a positive attitude wouldn't help. Her daughter was exactly like the Hulk, stale, completely uninterested in her mother, and not seeking to communicate with her at 18. She cut her out of her life, and now answers her calls. Not so much out of politeness as out of misunderstanding. Maybe she should admit it to herself and stop hoping for some kind of communication. Stop humiliating herself by begging for crumbs of attention. But Miranda wasn't ready for that. Her husband had died long ago. The old circle of socialization had disintegrated with her retirement and the change of tenants in the house. Her daughter was the only person close to her, so Bracker could not cut her out of her life and kept looking for all sorts of excuses. The mood was completely ruined. Her right side ached more today than before. And then there was that intrusive smell of my Moscow. Damn it to hell. I should tell that nasty cat all she thinks about her and her pets. Yes, she's ill-mannered, uneducated, and orderly, but she should eventually realize that her brews are interfering with the lives of normal people. Miranda slipped her feet into her elegant house shoes and set off determinedly to her neighbor's house. A choking wave of left-field odor from behind the neighbor's open door nearly mistook Miranda off her feet. Kelly stood on the doorstep in one of her tasteless, multicolored dresses, with her hair tousled behind the top of her head. An apron was tied over the top of the dress for salty or wet. Around her belly, Miranda splayed out her hands at the woman. "What's wrong? There's no face on you. Come and sit down." With a foot in her stubbed slippers, she pushed away from the door a snow-white cat with huge blue eyes and silky and long hair. "Step aside and pass the man," she commanded. Miranda, as belligerent as she was, had a belligerent attitude. "I couldn't help but wonder, Grandma," she interjected. "Is that the one you carried yesterday?" "Yes, the one I carried yesterday," Kelly confirmed, and leaned over and stroked the cat's back affectionately. "We washed her yesterday when the witches itched and took her apart. Some of them had to be cut off, but it's no big loss. They'll grow back. And anyway, before the operation, she'll have her belly shaved." "I see," Miranda stretched out in surprise, but immediately remembered the purpose of her visit. She tried to straighten her back, but the pain in her side was getting in the way. Her body kept trying to slump to the right. "Kelly, what was the point of the bracker?" But another jerk of pain on her right side made her wince and bend almost in half. "Sit down." The neighbor almost forcefully dragged Miranda, who had given Fish the hallway, and sat her down on the table. "For a long time my side pulls. I'll give you a pill now. Cast iron bile. It's very good." Bracker sank down on the seat and tried to object to the pill, but her side howled in a particularly strong way, and the woman slumped ungracefully on her side and lost consciousness. She woke up in the ambulance, lying on an uncomfortable stretcher with an IV stuck in her arm. Kelly's face loomed over her. "Be patient, my dear," the nurse said affectionately. "Why'd you let your bile go so badly? At our age, it's no joke. Now we'll come to the hospital. There the attack will be taken down, under treatment. Everything will be fine. I'm lying down. Don't worry, I used to work at this hospital. I know everyone there." Miranda suddenly calmed down from the chatter and fell back into oblivion. "Miranda, Mommy, wake up." She heard through the sleep there. "Ozia, you have to wake up. You can't sleep so long. It's time, my dear. Open your eyes." Mommy thought in surprise, and Ozia was called only by her. The dream was persistent, trying to pull the woman back in, but she overpowered herself and opened her eyes and saw the face of the nasty neighbor in front of her. "I think it still smelled like fish." "Wake up then, Mommy," joyfully asked the face. "What's your point?" Miranda said indignantly. Her voice was poorly controlled and her tongue was moving with difficulty, but the indignation was a good engine. She spoke the short phrase almost cleanly. "Now you're awake." Kelly laughed contentedly. "And you've already opened your eyes for half an hour and fall back into sleep. I've already how not to wake you up." She smiled again. "Stay there, Miranda. I'll call the doctor now." "What doctor?" I was gonna ask, but she didn't have time. Kelly disappeared from sight, and only in the distance there was a soft clang of the door. The woman tried to look around. She was lying on a bed that was soft, quite comfortable, and unaccustomedly high. A needle was stuck in her arm. A transparent tube stretched from it to a nearby drip. Behind the drip, the tube was visible, and behind it another bed. The room itself was bright, surprisingly clean, and slightly cool. Miranda tried to stand up to take a better look around, but there was another soft knock on the door, and she was sternly called out. "Where do you think you're going, dear? You're not supposed to get up yet." A middle-aged man in a white robe came to the bed. "Let's get acquainted," he said. "I'm your attending physician. And you are Miranda, right? How are you feeling?" The conversation with the doctor clarified a lot of things. It turned out that Miranda's gallbladder had burst, and she was brought to the hospital by ambulance with acute peritonitis and immediately sent to the operating table. The surgery lasted several hours, as it was complicated, and there were some problems in the process due to Bracker's poor blood clotting. But praise be to the surgeons. It all worked out. Lethality was avoided. Now Miranda will have to spend about a month in the hospital. We'll have to wait for the stitches to heal, for her internal organs to normalize. Plus a couple of tests would be nice. "You can't get up for a while," Mason said. "You'll have to lie down for about a week or your stitches could come apart. It's not a good idea to turn from side to side, either. Try to take care of yourself." "Well, Kelly's watching you. I take it I am." "Of course I am." The nurse nodded. You don't want to leave a man completely helpless. I must say you're very lucky, Mason said. We're short-staffed for the whole ward, which is almost 100 beds. There are only 3 nurses and 2 orderlies. The girls are bursting at the seams. Naturally, it is impossible to provide quality care in such conditions, and you'll have a personal nurse. Oh yes, a very good one. I remember the qualifications. Kelly's qualifications from when she worked for us. You'll have the highest level of care. The neighbor behind him blushed slightly and looked down in embarrassment. Miranda thought she would probably prefer the complete absence of a caregiver to the constant presence of this blessed woman. But she didn't have to choose, alas. The ward was a double room. In the second bed lay a young maiden who had gotten here also for peritonitis, only caused by an appendix. Peritonitis was missed. She had been on her feet for almost 12 o'clock. So the girl's post-op condition was no better than Miranda's. She was also forbidden to get up. It was required to follow a strict diet and take medication regularly. Kelly took care of her too. What was annoying about Bracker? Not because she was in any way disadvantaged by this voluntary help. It's just that Miranda couldn't understand the point of all this trouble. Why the nurse was patronizing a girl she didn't know. She was trying to share. She wanted to be good for everyone. The woman decided. The girl called herself Lisa and made friends with her nurse surprisingly easily. She could spend hours talking to her, asking her about her past, sharing her childhood experiences. It's understandable, though. No one visited the girl, and she was obviously bored in the ward. Chatter, a nurse, and some entertainment. Miranda didn't get any visits either, although Kelly informed her that she had told Cindy about her hospitalization and all the neighbors. Bracker secretly hoped that one of them would decide to check on her. But for the first few days, there were no visitors. The woman decided that for the time being, because of her serious condition, they simply did not allow anyone to visit her, and she forbade herself to think about it. It was a shame to realize that of all the old guard of neighbors, nobody cared about her. And the uneducated nurse who had recently moved in, treating her like a little kid. And Kelly did take care of her. Every morning she came to the ward, bringing with her a bag of food suited to her ward's diet. Different meals were prepared for Lisa and for Miranda, which, despite their devotion, identity were still much tastier than the meager hospital kitchen. Kelly Huma willed her charges to help them to the toilet, tidy them up after their sleep, and then began to feed them and fed them literally from a spoon, deftly and carefully, gently coaxing them to eat the whole portion. She managed to treat her patients strictly and affectionately at the same time, and this manner was pleasing to Miranda, but it also pissed her off. A couple of days later, she asked Kelly to tell Cindy to call Christina and tell her everything. The woman hoped that her daughter would rush to the hospital and change the stupid chicken. Kelly's on nursing duty. She had already tried by all means to dissuade the girl from staying in the ward permanently. "It must be hard for you to take care of me," Miranda said in a sympathetic voice. "No way." The nurse waved her away. "There are only 2 patients. It's a resort. That's when I was in charge of the whole ward. That's where I had to run. And with you, I even have time to read a book. But you spend all day here. What about your cats? Did you leave them unattended?" Miranda pretended to be worried. Wouldn't the cats be lost? Kelly smiled. "My sister-in-law moved in, and I gave her all the feeding instructions, and she's been taking care of them since the surgery. We should wait a couple weeks before we put her back on the street. Here's more of your sister's-in-law's troubles," Bracker lamented. "You what?" laughed the nurse. "And she, on the contrary, is happy," said, "compared to the constant cleaning in a 2-story house and daily care for 3 grown men. That's my son and my grandchildren. So I have a resort for her." Kelly had an answer for everything. And to Bracker's surprise, she really didn't get bogged down by her situation or try to exploit it. For example, to make friends with her neighbor, to get closer to her. After the obligatory procedures, The caregiver usually took care of a book or started chatting with Lisa. If the latter expressed such a desire to communicate with her ward, she did not impose with inquiries. Apart from the obligatory questions about his well-being, she did not pester him. If it had been a stranger, Miranda would not have been bothered by his presence at all. But it was Kelly, whom Bracker had grown accustomed to disliking over the past year. And so the woman waited daily for her daughter and asked the nurse daily, had Cindy mentioned that Christina had called? She answered in the negative each time, and Bracker thought with regret that she must not have gotten through yet. The morning didn't exactly start on schedule. Miranda had Miranda's and fed her broth to Dryad. Kelly began to make herself comfortable in the chair by the window. Usually the nurse would go to wash the dishes after breakfast. Then she would bring a bucket and a mop and begin to clean up the room. Today the ritual was broken. "I'll wait for the doctor," said the nurse. "Yesterday you took the tests, right? I want to ask how the results and what prognosis do you hope to find out? How long do you have to deal with me?" Miranda grinned. "Oh, really?" Kelly seemed a little offended. "I just need to know what to look for. Maybe you need some medication to speed up your recovery. Don't worry, if you're not feeling well, I won't bother you. I'll sit quietly. Or you want me to read you a book?" Kelly took out another paperback novel with a brightly colored cover. "Very good author," she said in a pretty voice. "I love reading her so much. She's so easy to read. And it's just like life. Let me ask you something." Miranda reached for the book and began to look at the cover. Out of desperation, a mother of many children gave her daughter to an old oligarch, and after a while the whole family came to visit them. She read the abstract and laughed. "Kelly, so what's it like in life here? Do you know a lot of large families who get contacted by oligarchs? What's the big deal?" Surprised neighbor. "I, for example, my grandfather and grandmother married like that." "Your grandfather was an oligarch," I heard a voice from my bed. "Lisa, wow, were there oligarchs back then?" "But my grandfather was a merchant of the first guild. By the way, he traded in women's goods. His trading house had in St. Petersburg and a few more stores in the region. He supplied the imperial family with various ladies' trifles, so that in those days he was an oligarch. A merchant, then," Miranda thought. "It must be in the family's blood to be a merchant." "Wow," Lisa marveled. "Tell me about them and your grandmother." "Oh, please, why shouldn't I? He's docile," Kelly agreed. "Miranda, would you mind if we chatted?" "No, not at all," Miranda said politely. She couldn't bear to quarrel with her nurse and roommate. "I'd like to hear it too." "All right, then, peace and quiet," Kelly said. "Just enough time to pass before the doctor gets here. Well, my grandfather was a merchant of the First Guild, had a house in St. Petersburg, and a mansion in a village nearby. He used to go there for the summer. He did serious business," Clara said. $1 million in philanthropy. He even helped children's schools. He paid scholarships to gifted students from poor families. And everything was going well for him. But bad luck. God didn't give him any children. His first wife was empty. They lived together for about 10 years, maybe more, and she didn't change. And then she died of consumption. My grandfather was widowed in due time and began to think of a new marriage. He really wanted an heir. He always said I'd created a good business. It would be a pity if it disappeared after my death. I must pass it on to someone. Well, Clara was from a noble family. Wow, Miranda smiled ironically against her will. So you must have aristocratic roots. On your grandmother's side? Yes, Kelly agreed. It's no use being aristocratic. She waved her hand irritably. About it only in novels you read good, but in reality nothing good. You know what they say, silk on the belly, silk in the belly. That's how our grandmother's family lived. A noble title, a long pedigree, and they barely made ends meet. And their father was young and spendthrift, and his fortune and great-grandmother's capital he skipped, all in restaurants courted. He played cards and went to resorts, and he didn't think that there were 7 children at home who had to be raised somehow. They had an estate. Yeah, they took it away for debts. They kept the house in town on their last pennies and couldn't afford it anymore. Yes, great-grandfather didn't want to give it up and move into a rented apartment. It was a blow to his reputation. You see, he kept servants and updated the furniture. He'd throw dinner parties. He did his best to create the appearance of wealth. But he went broke, of course. How did he find out he was bankrupt? He put a bullet in his forehead. Simple as that. What about your great-grandmother? Sarah, you're left with a lot of debt. He didn't care they had 7 kids. My great-grandfathers had a son, the eldest, then a son and 5 more younger ones. And they all had to be taught, fed, organized. They had the house foreclosed on in bankruptcy. Great-grandmother disbanded the servants, sold what she could, hired a small apartment, and they moved there. Nanny moved in with them. She was already old. She didn't want to leave the kids. She ran the whole household, took care of the kids. She worked for housing and food, but instead of a governess, my great-grandmother did it herself. She taught them everything: history, literature, languages, and drawing. She was an educated woman. I don't understand how she had time for everything. Kelly shook her head contritely and continued. The eldest son was given a position by his great-grandmother. She got him a job. And then Clara grew up 15 years. It's time to take the girl out to find a groom. What's there to look for? They don't have a single decent dress left. Dad, they all wore them. There was a debutante ball planned. Clara's going to it. Socially, she could be there, but not financially. But I couldn't miss the event. It was a chance. So my great-grandmother went to her relatives, near and far, to ask for money to get my grandmother together for the trip. It took her a long time to get through all kinds of reception centers. Somewhere in one of them, my grandfather spotted her. My grandfather was just being businesslike. He wanted a wife who would bear an heir. Clara's young, so there's a good chance of a large family, and one in which none of the babies had died. So the heredity is good, but not rich, which means they're fastidious. It won't cost a lot of money. He asked about my great-grandmother's family and came to talk to her. He promised that he'd support the family, and if she would give birth to his first son, he would provide her younger sisters with dowry. And he also demanded that the bride should be examined by a doctor and told whether there were any health obstacles for the birth of a child. It was like choosing a pedigree dog. Lisa said confusedly. Sort of, agreed Kelly. But in those days, often about so brides were chosen by pedigree, taking into account their own benefit. They didn't think much about love back then, only in books. What was it? Miranda was suddenly fascinated by history. Your great-grandmother agreed. Where could she go? She said in a self-evident tone of voice. Of course she repented. Wow, what words does our nurse know? Miranda marveled to herself. Misalliance, Kelly continued. Clara is from a noble family, from an old family. Her grandfather was a merchant, and he was in his late 50s, and Slaga was 15. But great-grandmother realized that she could hardly find a better groom for her daughter. There will be all sorts of noblemen chasing after the title. And if someone from the nobility is as poor as they are, and the grandfather was a man solid, reliable with a reputation for family maintenance promised. In general, great-grandmother decided to ask Lisa. No one asked Lisa. Kelly waved her hand. She was just faced with the fact. But she is a sensible girl. It was not to be spared. All she did was tell me that it was humiliating to be examined by a doctor. I've been listening to her stories, you know, and thinking for 15 years. Well, she's just a girl. My granddaughter is 16 now. I look at her. Well, she's still a child playing with dolls. What marriage? What children? And at that time, they believe that it is already a suitable age to take on the role of mistress of the house, wife, and mother. That's not how girls were brought up back then. Miranda stepped in. They were prepared for such a fate, and I don't think your grandmother would have crossed her. She understood that it was her duty to save her family, and her duty to people of her origin. It's very important. Above all, an aristocratic upbringing with meaning, she finished. Maybe, Kelly nodded. It's just a pity. I didn't care for her when she told me all that. Her great-grandmother was worried about her daughter, of course. There's a big age difference between her and her husband, and she should give birth as soon as possible. What if that merchant starts hurting her? What if the conception doesn't work out? A lot of different things. What if it did? But everything worked out in this marriage. A year after the wedding, she gave birth to her firstborn son. How did you order it? Grandfather, as the child saw, she told me, sobbed with happiness. And since then, he was ready to carry his young wife in his arms and never refused her anything. She told me when her great-grandmother came to visit them. Yes, when she saw how her grandfather treated her, she only nodded her head. She said that he was a merchant of a trade class, but he treated his wife with affection and respect. So she did not see such treatment from every nobleman, and from her husband, my great-grandfather, that is, and even more so. In vain, she was worried. Then she gave birth to 2 more children, my second son and my daughter Mama. And my grandfather kept his promise. The family Clara took on the content, hired them a good house servants younger in the gymnasium boarding school, arranged sister's dowry, put outings in the world paid. In general, naturally the whole family was saved. Great-grandmother at least lived out her life in peace and prosperity. Why only great-grandmother? Lisa asked. And the Sligas are yours. Why did they live in peace and prosperity? What about the family 1 million? Kelly looked at the girl affectionately and condescendingly, as she looks at a child who has passed an obviously stupid and a little inappropriate question. But not out of spite, just out of ignorance. It was at the turn of the century, my dear, she said calmly. My mother was born a girl before the revolution. I, of course, were older, but all the same teenagers. And when the Bolsheviks came, my grandfather was shot. His shops were nationalized, and my grandmother and her children were evicted from the city. As a class alien element, what became of her sisters and brothers? She didn't know until her death. At that moment, she was afraid to turn to them for help, as if they themselves would not be jeopardized. And then they were confused. You can't find everything. Back then, many people changed their names and forged documents. Just to hide their origins, they traveled all over the country. Do you know where and under what names to look for relatives now? Women, even with their children, wandered around the provinces for a long time. The eldest son became a revolutionary during these wanderings. He joined the Red Army and disappeared somewhere during the Civil War. The younger son died of diphtheria, and Clara and my mother. In the end, we settled in a village in the Pskov region. It was a small village of 20 yards. They made it a branch of a large collective farm. They'd provided work and a house. My mom grew up there, met my father, and got married. I was born in 30. Then I had a little brother and a little sister. We never ran out of them. So we lived quietly. And how come you're from the Pskov region? Did Kelly get to us in the Sverdlovsk region? Miranda asked. To cultivate the virgin land. Let's go. As a woman suddenly got angry. I know, as the German came and drove us out of our place, it was still a long way to the virgin land then. She grumbled, disapprovingly, looking at the neighbor. Oh, Kelly, Lisa exclaimed. And you were still a little girl during the war. Do you remember anything about it? Do you or don't you? If you don't want to, if it hurts, don't tell me. Were you evacuated? Yes, evacuated. Kelly said the word irritated. Jesus, girl. They evacuated factories with their employees, scientific institutes and factories. People who were potentially valuable to the state, you know. And who are we? Kolkhozniki. Plowing the land and pulling weeds is not much of a specialty. Valuable specialization, they say, is anyone. Even a complete idiot can be trained. Why should the state waste resources evacuating villages? The war will be over. Will it find someone to send to the collective farms and get them involved in the raising of virgin lands? I'm sorry, Kelly, Miranda spoke conciliatorily. I guess I'm weak, and my head doesn't want to think. I didn't realize that your childhood was during the war years. I started asking you silly questions. You don't have to tell me, if you don't want to remember. She herself was born a year before the war and didn't remember the war years at all. And it was hardly possible to compare the rear strike with the central part of the country, where fierce battles were boiling. To remember, said the nurse in a tone quite conciliatory, but with an obvious touch of bitterness. Yes, if I ever forget it, I'll tell you now that I started, and our doctor is delayed somewhere. Both patients fell silent and looked at the splits with expectant sympathy and gratitude. Kelly took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts and perhaps her spirit for the story. Our little village was about 20 yards. I don't remember what it was called. And now I don't even recognize it anymore. We lived mostly in vegetable gardens. We didn't keep cattle. It was expensive and troublesome. Working on the collective farm took up a lot of time. We had only a cat at home. Of course, Miranda thought, without a cat. Kelly smiled gently. She could see that she was pleased to remember the museum. The cat was our babysitter, she said. My little grandmother would put me in the yard, and she would put benches around me so I wouldn't crawl anywhere, and she would rustle around the yard or dig in the vegetable garden. I'm sitting with boredom for a roar. And then there's a 6-stone beach rubbing around, licking her face, touching her paws, calming her down. So my grandmother said you consume her by the ears and chew her tail and knit pretzels with your paw. But she puts up with it. She understands that you can't hurt a child. That's how she taught me. And then my younger ones. But they were smaller. I helped the nanny there. And Boska followed me all over the village, like a little dog, seeing me off everywhere. How did the war start? All our men were taken to the front, and my father too. There was only one man left in the whole village. There was one man, I mean his house, opposite ours. He often came to our house as a neighbor. That's what the younger ones called him. They couldn't pronounce it yet. He was one-legged, walked on wood. Where did he ask to serve? They turned him down, and we were left with only women. Yes, kids, a few old men. The Germans captured Pskov at the very beginning of the war. It's clear that they quickly took the surrounding villages under their control. But we didn't really know anything. Our village was in the middle of nowhere. We only heard all the news on the radio. There was no other way. We heard the rumble of fighting from afar. But what was going on? Who was winning? Didn't know. Not for long. This our ignorance continued to sway again silent, rolled to the window, then to the door something long. The doctor's not coming today. She mumbled, as if to herself, then sighed and continued talking. The summer was hot, then stood drought. But that day, especially hot, was the day Mom and Clara took Perrin outside. They laid out the cushions in the sun to roast. We opened the cellar for a little juice. We had 2 cellars, one in the house and the other on the street, on the edge of the plot. We kept potatoes in it. The potatoes were all gone for the winter. So we opened it. About frying. The kids and I were hanging around outside, and my Buska was nearby. I'm afraid of her. Suddenly, she'll break free and run away from me. I'll follow her, and she'll go out of the yard and towards the open cellar. I followed her, and she was throwing a pin in her teeth into the cellar, and she was racing down the stairs. I followed her so cleverly, but I stumbled into the cellar and fell. Clara saw it and ran after me. I hear her calling me from above. Can't I get up? Yes, I can. It was a big mistake, but I had a fight, and she started to come down after me. And somehow she turned so much while she was coming down that she dropped the supports and the cellar lid slammed down on her. And though it was wooden and happy, it was already heavy. But it was heavy. It's good. You can't just open it from the inside. But she came down to me and fumbled. She says I'm all right. I didn't break anything. You just bumped yourself. Yeah, I got scared. We'll climb back up on our own. She climbed up the ladder and pushed the lid, but it wouldn't budge, and it's not comfortable with the ladder, You can't push it anywhere. Grandma had a fight with her. Paulo Hello came back down to me. We sat next to each other. We are sitting. Buska is here torturing something. Clara scolded her with milk and lured the girl here, and me after her outrage. So we're sitting here. What else can we do? One hope that Mom will look for us. She'll call us around the yard and see that the cellar has slammed shut. Maybe she'll figure it out, or the little one will show her. We've been sitting for a long time. No one's looking for us outside. There's some noise. We made some noise too, but not much. It's no use shouting. It hurts to bang on the lid with our fists. I guess they can't hear us either. I dozed off, and I smelled through my sleep from under the cellar lid, as fried meat smells like cutlets or, say, shish kebab. Where would meat come from at that time? I lay there thinking, what a good dream. Then I got hungry. Woke up finally. Grandma's dozing too. She's sitting up. I hear snoring. How long did we sleep like that? I don't even know. I blurted out, saying I was hungry. She told me to crawl around the pit, to crawl, to scrounge. Suddenly, she says, what potatoes, Lena, or carrots? So I started searching. I didn't find any food, but I found a thick dirk. I don't know where it came from in the cellar, said Clara. She found it. She grabbed it and began to beat the lid with it. It was easier than using her hands from the ladder. He directly from the floor to the edge of climbing. To get grandmother with it, the lid of the cellar a little managed to move, and then she was already pushing her little by little. That's how she opened the way up for us. We got out of the cellar to go for a walk, and our village was gone. What do you mean gone? Lisa marveled. Are you in a parallel world like in science fiction? No, dear, sighed Kelly. The world was our very real one. And the ashes of our village are also quite real. Even the village is still somewhere. But from our house, only the hulk of a stove remains, and a pile of burnt logs. And the neighbors' houses, where there are more, where there are less, neither houses nor barns. Smoke and ashes by the coals, ruins, and the smell of burning. Clara is standing over it all, crossing herself, unable to utter a word. I, looking around, can't understand anything. Buska came out after us. She's shouting in her own way and looking around. And from the neighboring plot, a man is coming towards us. Look at him, a man, Grammy, all in sundresses. And he told us everything about what happened. He was hiding from the heat in the house. He heard a noise outside and looked out the window. Germans on motorcycles entered the village, stood in the middle of the street, scattered in the yards, and let's pull out of the houses all the barn, wool or baths, all outbuildings. In general, while the rivers were howling, while the houses were howling, one of the soldiers grabbed our mom and began to twirl her in all directions, saying that she was beautiful. So he decided to take care of her. And Mom came back. She grabbed the shovel and he didn't look back at him yet. Another soldier from behind jumped up to the rifle and hit Mom on the head, hit her head with the butt of the rifle. She fell into the house from being dragged. They threw the kids in with her. Yeah, locked up. He saw with irony that the soldiers were coming to his house, and he had a wonderful house with 2 entrances, one door to the street, and the other from the house to the vegetable garden. So he jumped out the second door. Yes, into his little dome. Oligarch was unattended, all mixed up. So he survived there in the bushes. They didn't see him from there and washed him. The Germans gathered all the villagers in the street and put the older kids in a column and the rest of them in the nearest houses and locked them up, then doused them with gasoline and set them on fire. The summer was hot and dry before the gasoline was still busy quickly. Women screaming, children crying. People in the houses were pounding on the windows. One aunt jumped out of the column and ran to her house. Her mother was lying there, not walking, so they put her down immediately with a machine gun and drove our villagers along the road shooting only upwards for fun. And they, as the column disappeared through the bushes, crawled up to Chan with water. They were collecting water for irrigation, so he dived there. That's where the fire is, and waited out. And when the fire died down, he went around the village to look. Maybe there was a survivor. Who else found us like that? Seraph didn't say. I'm sitting, looking at all this fists clenching roar like a little child, and I realize that I can do nothing. I won't help my son or anyone else. I'll just lie down myself. And it's so disgusting. A young woman grabbed a shovel, and she wasn't afraid. And I'm a soldier. I went through the war and hid in the bushes. But that's what he said later. But then, as he told me everything, I turned around and went to our house. I remember walking with her back straight. She always had good posture. She was brought up from childhood not to be proud. But then, there was something scary about that straight back. It was like she was made of wood. It was like a woman walking like a dead woman. What kind of pagan idol? Floating above the ground, heavy and clumsy. Grandmother came to the place where the porch stood, collapsed to the ground and howled. Kelly was quiet for a moment, then turned to her neighbor. You say, Miranda, aristocratic upbringing, dignity. That's all of it. And I tell you, in moments of the bitterest grief, of the blackest despair, every creature and aristocrat, and peasant woman, and wolf, forest, and stray dog howls the same. The terrible vine was from within, walking, all bodies turned. We watched ironically, but we couldn't move. It seems necessary to approach, to comfort his scary nose to the place chained, as if I realized later, we would then and would not have done anything. As someone consoles, when a person suddenly and at once lost, and daughter and grandchildren, and the shelter of a lifetime, consider, you should have. It's up to you to turn it off, to cut it out, to let it out of you. There can be no help in such a case. A man has to do it himself. The main thing is not to interfere. Miranda lowered her eyes. She didn't know what to say. She had never experienced such emotions. Even the deaths of her husband and parents had been taken for granted and inevitable. But the orderly story had shaken her, and not only her. Jesus, Lisa muttered and took a drink. We went into the woods afterward, Kelly continued, not paying much attention to the sobbing. At first we tried one neighboring village. It was useless to go to another. Everywhere, the Germans decided then to keep deep and wait for our soldiers to come. They couldn't fail to come, could they? But we quickly realized that we could not survive even a summer in the forest. We had nothing with us. No tools, no warm clothes, no food, only a knife. He took it when he ran out of the house. We took a bucket from the well. They used it to carry the embers from that fire. They made fires with them, kept them as the apple of their eye. Without fire in the forest, it was like death to be left behind. So the three of us went to the neighboring region. I mean, 4 of us. Of course, Bosco went with us. I refused to leave without her. Clara persuaded me that I would carry her in my arms all the way. But I wouldn't leave her. And Grandma didn't mind. She said, how could I leave her here? If she saved our lives, if she didn't lure you into the cellar, we'd be lying here in the ruins of coal. And she apologized to the music, saying I shouldn't have taken you to the cellar. What's the matter with you? I wish I'd known sooner. I would have sent my daughter and grandchildren to run after you. Anyway, Bosca came with us. Part of the way I carried her, part of the way she ran beside me. We weren't walking fast then either. We didn't have much strength. We were hungry, digging up some roots and chewing grass. Then by midsummer berries and mushrooms came. It became easier. So imagine, she fed us and caught bigger birds or frogs and brought them to us. Ironically, they were carved on the fire with pieces on the branches. And we ate them, and we ate the frogs. Lisa didn't believe it. And we ate frogs. Agreed to be swayed. Why shouldn't we eat them? The French right. They eat them. And what's worse for us? The beach saved us in the end. Already closer to autumn, we have completely strengthened. And we never reached the neighboring region. They got confused. No other way. And here she is one morning and calls us somewhere. She's really calling us. She walks a couple steps away and turns around. She's looking at us, and she's teaching us. But we followed her. It seemed like a wilderness of some kind, and she kept calling. We go. We don't know why, but we go. And eventually we came to a partisan camp. Yes, it was so open that we wouldn't have found it ourselves. The cat is a beast. It understands these things better than man. It smelled the place to live. It was our life-saving cat that led us to it. We lived in the camp for a while, treated, rested, ate a little. And then the partisans took us to the railroad. They had their own people at the station, or what should we call it? I didn't know then, and I don't know now. Anyway, they put us on a train with the evacuees. With them, we ended up in Sverdlovsk and settled down here. She lived with me all her life until she was 90 years old. She lived to see her great-grandchildren, and wherever we lived with her, she always fed street cats, treated them, nursed them back to health, and thanked the whole cat family. So, for being alive. And I did the same thing and still do. If it wasn't for the cat, I wouldn't be alive. What about your Boska? Didn't you take her with you to Sverdlovsk? Lisa was surprised. No, she shook her head. Kelly Bushka with irony stayed near Pskov. In the partisan camp, Serov did not want to take revenge for the village and fellow villagers. So he joined the partisan movement. There his village instead of a leg was not looked at much, and Boska refused to go with us. We thought she let us know that she helped us as much as she could. You'll manage on your own from now on. And in the camp she was only welcome. There were a lot of mice in the dugouts. So our cat went to the partisans too. Finished swinging with a smile. You, Kelly, should write books too, said Lisa. Such a fate, you know. The girl's eyes were still wet, but the partisan cat seemed to have cheered her up a little and calmed her down. That you waved your hand, Kelly Andreevna. Such fates are full of Russia. Just dig. The Leningrad blockade survivors. Listen or read. That's where the fates are. That's where people were unbending. That's where everyone had a notion of duty and dignity, no matter whether they were aristocrats or peasants. Miranda caught the stiletto in her address, but she didn't answer it. She was too much shaken by the story told by her neighbor. Horror, pity, shame, embarrassment, empathy, and admiration all at once rose up in her soul. Until all this is not settled, did not want to speak aloud. And I have no books to write. The nurse added, it's me who can tell a story out loud, but 2 words are not fresh on paper. Even letters have always been hard for me. There's our Dr. Mason, and we're waiting for you. Mommy, wake up. Miranda heard it through her sleep. She didn't want to open her eyes. All night she'd been replaying in her head Kelly's story. Empathized, and the ordeal the elderly woman and her family endured sympathized with her sorrow. Terrorized by the introduction of a burned village and a woman with a shovel fighting off German soldiers, fed herself for the fact that so coldly and arrogantly communicated with her neighbor, considering kind treatment of her beneath her dignity, for teasing her about her fiddling with the cats, for all these worries to fall asleep only in the morning. And then, Mom, wake up. The voice sounded irritated. A strong hand grasped Bracker's shoulder and shook him. The woman reluctantly molded her eyelids, but immediately brightened. Standing in front of the bed was Christina. Christina, Miranda's daughter, was with a man. Cindy finally got through to you. And Cindy, yeah, she called a week ago. And she shrugged her shoulder. I haven't had time to get out to see you. You know, business, and your visiting hours are terrible. They're inconveniently scheduled. I just came in and slipped the nurse a tenner to let me into the ward. There was a squawk in the next bed. Lisa raised her head curiously, looking at the visitor. Hello, she said. Christina ignored the greeting. I see you've got a nice room from the VIP segment. That's what the nurse told me, who let me in, the girl explained. Let's go, she said. We have VIP rooms here. Well, I thought so. You bet. My mother won't be lying with all those people. Miranda felt herself blushing. Are you all right here? She asked her daughter. Yes, I'm fine, Bracker mumbled. She suddenly felt awkward talking to Christina like this behind her back, not at this meeting, and after a restless night. In addition, her bladder suddenly began to remind her of itself. "Christina, there is a vessel under the bed." "Embarrassed," said Miranda. "Hand it over, please." "Where's your nurse?" The daughter was surprised, not moving from her seat. "I was told there's a grandmother looking after you. Hired someone." "It's my neighbor who takes care of me," the woman explained. "The neighbor is that you seem to be except for food. No one else has not really communicated with anyone." Christina was surprised and seemed to have completely forgotten about the request for a boat. "New roommate Kelly," Miranda explained. "Is this your crazy Friday or what?" Her daughter quirked an eyebrow. "You're friends with her, aren't you?" "Look, Mom, be careful. They say it's contagious by the ears. Soon you'll be gathering your relatives on the streets too." Miranda blushed even more. She felt sorry that she had once described the new neighbor and her emotions about her to her daughter in a fit of irritation. Out of the corner of her eye, the woman noticed Lisa's face. The girl could hardly restrain herself from cutting Christina short for thinking out loud and throwing herself on the defense. Kelly, however, suddenly realized her daughter. "You said she worked as an orderly." "But that's right." "Then you're getting professional care. Good for you. You know who to get. Although, of course, I'd rather have a nurse than an orderly. But that's probably more expensive. You're probably costing yourself a fortune with your treatment, considering the room." "Christina," the ship tried to remind Miranda, but the door opened and Kelly walked in with her usual bag of groceries. "Good morning," she said, her traditional affectionate greeting. "Oh, we have visitors already." "Not too early. There's a reason for the regimen." "Your regimen doesn't work for me," Christina said. "I can't leave my clients to spend the middle of the day on Maiden going to hospitals." Of course, Lisa said to herself, client girls are any more expensive than their own mother. Christina turned sharply to the girl, and Miranda realized that a scandal was about to break out. She hurried to intervene. "Kelly, this is my daughter Christina," she said. "She has a very busy schedule indeed. Don't turn us in to the doctors, please." "Christina, this is Kelly, and you're the one taking care of Mom," says the daughter. "Oh, great." It didn't occur to her to say hello to the lady who came in, of course. "Since your nurse is here, I'll go. I won't bother you," said Christina. "She'll get you a boat, by the way. Don't wait for the doctor." "Would you like a chat?" the nurse asked. "Why should I?" Christina was surprised. "I see Mom's alive. She's homeless. What else? In medical terms, I do not understand anything anyway. And your doctor will probably scold me as well as you for breaking the regimen." She picked up her purse and turned to Kelly. "Do I owe you anything?" "What do you mean?" The woman didn't understand. For taking care of you," Christina explained. "You're wasting your time and energy." Kelly frowned slightly. "You don't owe me anything." "It's all right," she replied sternly. "I'm just helping out. Humanly, neighborly. That's fine." She instantly calmed down. "Oh, by the way, Mom, I brought you some hotels. I almost forgot." Her daughter rummaged through her bag and put on the nightstand a plump bag filled with fatty arrests. "The flavor of what rivers?" The women stared at him in bewilderment. Miranda felt like crying or falling through the bunk with shame. "My mother-in-law had gotten a little crazy last night," Christina explained without embarrassment. "There's a whole basin in the heat, and where should we put it? Lenichka has gastritis. I'm on a diet. Boys do not eat such things. You know today's teenagers. All they want is hamburgers and pizza." "Do you have to go, Christina?" Unexpectedly hard, said Kelly. The girl did not argue and quickly disappeared out the door, waved to her mother. The room was silent as she said goodbye. Miranda covered her face with her hands. Lisa said slowly and in surprise, "What the hell is this?" But Kelly silenced the girl with a quick glance. She leaned toward her ward. But then the door of the room banged softly. Mason came in on his morning rounds. When he saw the package on the bedside table, he froze in the middle of the room and was angrily perplexed. "Kelly's nurse for you," he said angrily. "What are these tricks?" What's the chebariki for? Miranda had her gallbladder removed. We fought for hours in the OR to keep her alive. And you want to undo all our work. Now, every kid knows that after a surgery like that, you need a strict diet. And you, with your experience in our field, you're seriously considering feeding it to your ward. What kind of sabotage is this? Bracker crumpled into her pillow. She was already terribly ashamed of her daughter and her inappropriate innings that so blatantly showed her disregard for her mother. And how to explain herself to the doctor about it, she had no idea at all. She bitterly remembered how she had waited for Christina, hoping that she would take care of her, rid her of her unlovely neighbor, and mocked herself. Had she forgotten what her daughter was? Once daring, she imagined her as a caregiver, and to add to the mental torment, her bladder was increasingly active. Mason rushed Kelly. Yeah, what do you think? I brought these for you. Well, I mean, not just you. All orders of tartar named Sis. You know, I went on a baking binge last night. I had a whole bowl of them coming over. My son has gastritis. My daughter-in-law is on a diet. And the grandkids don't eat that stuff. They want hamburgers and pizza. You know what she was doing to today's teenagers. I know you're coming in on your rounds, so I took them out right away to give them to you. You'll take them to me right after your rounds. You're drinking tea. We'll talk about mine and Miranda's. Because we haven't had a chance yet. I just came by to tell you today. Behind this chatter, Kelly taught the doctor a bag with the unfortunate Cheburik and pushed him to the door, securing his promise to come with an examination. In half an hour. You, having seen Mason off, the woman approached the bedside of her ward. Miranda, are you okay? She asked. I'll take care of the washing up. Disgusting. Miranda confessed honestly. We will. But first, Kelly, please give me the boat. Miranda steered with confidence. After a week and a half, she began to get out of bed and walk around the ward and then around the department. The only thing that struck her about the surgery was the clean and tidy corridor. The wards had not seen repairs for a long time, and the cleanliness in them was kept very relative. In fact, when the walls of Lascuto fly off the paint to wash them, they are often not an easy task. No matter how hard the local nurses tried, they could not achieve sterile and neat rooms. Most of the wards had 6 to 9 beds. The narrow aisles between them were occupied by bedside tables. When it was necessary to enter the room to the ceiling, for example, when placing a patient from the operating room began turmoil, nightstands were taken out into the corridor. Beds were moved so that the girl could pass. Walking patients were asked to move out of their seats for a while. And over all this prison hovered the heavy odor of paid bodies, medicines, waste, human life, blood, puss, and others in the wards. How much was not mine? How much was not ventilation, not quartz? It was impossible to get rid of it. Miranda thanked fate for lying in more comfortable conditions. However, she realized that fate had nothing to do with it in this case. Even after Christina's visit, she was interested in the mention of her daughter, and in the VIP wards, she tried to question the girl and got a simple explanation. When were you brought in? There were no beds in the regular wards. You could either go to the corridor or to a paid room, as long as they were available. But I asked them not to put you in the corridor. It's impossible to lie in such conditions after surgery. Mason and I go way back. He was very cooperative. Bracker tried asking questions about the cost of the room, how long they'd keep her here, what would happen if she needed a paid spot. But Kelly only guffawed and told her ward not to fill her head with trivia. The mystery of the VIP place came to Miranda unexpectedly and shocked her, perhaps more than anything she had already learned about her caregiver roommate. That day, 3 weeks after the operation, Lisa was discharged. The girl was already quite recovered and was happily bustling around the room, packing and daydreaming aloud. How the first thing she would do after coming home would be to take a bath with fragrant foam. The ward had a shower room, but patients were forbidden to wash. Surgery, you have to wait for the stitches to fully heal, so they had made do with only wounds, bodies and woes since they had been hospitalized, since they could stand up and walk confidently. Miranda was slightly envious of the girl. Lisa was picked up by her father, a middle-aged man, dressed expensively and stylishly, and holding himself with restrained politeness. The girl hugged Miranda goodbye, and Kelly dragged her along to walk her to the car. Bracker pulled onto the bed and closed her eyes. It had been almost a month since she had been alone indoors in relative silence. Turns out she missed it a lot. She lay quietly, motionless, and enjoyed the surrounding emptiness and absence of extraneous sounds. The chance to relax and not hold her face, just to rest from everyone for a few minutes at least. When the ward door banged softly, she didn't open her eyes, wanting to prolong her solitude just a little longer. Perhaps Kelly would think she'd fallen asleep and be away on her own for a while. The footsteps of two people strode through the room, rubbing the steps of two people. Then there was a slight rustle at the next bedside, and Kelly's voice said in a half-whisper, "Come on. You shouldn't have come up. I would have gotten it myself." "Wait, Kelly." Also a muffled male voice answered her. Miranda recognized Lisa's father. "I specifically went with you to talk to you in private. Tell me, how long does your ward have to stay in the hospital?" "Until the end of next week. That's 10 days. Have you decided what you're going to do with the ward yet?" "Oh, Kelly, I haven't yet. But I'm gonna talk to the head of the pay ward today. There are openings right now. I'm hoping they won't all be taken in the next few days, so we don't have to worry. Mason has promised to assist me in this conversation." "Kelly, there's a simpler solution. I will pay for this room for the next 10 days. Then it will be listed as yours, and you really won't have to worry. We'll consider it your fee for taking care of Lisa." "Oh, really?" The nurse's voice became embarrassed. "I've received my fee in full. You let Miranda stay here. You didn't object to a second bed. That's what we agreed. In fact, didn't we? Lisa's been discharged. You no longer require my services. Then consider this a tip." The man's voice was insistent. "You see, Kelly, it's not just that you've saved me the money to pay for a nurse and the trouble of finding one. I see the way Lisa interacts with you, the way she's bonded with you. That is more important to me than professional care. You've given my daughter emotional support. You've kept her from falling into depression. You've become a real friend to her since the surgery. That means a lot to her, and that means a lot to me. I was worried sick on my business trip. How did Lisa take it all? She's a home girl. She's never even been to kids' camps. She's never been away from home alone for any length of time. I was worried that she would be frightened of her new surroundings, that she would be oppressed by the pain and helplessness. But she didn't mention any of that yesterday or today. But you've been praised to the hilt. She even asked for permission to invite you to visit us. By the way, would you be willing to visit us?" "Yes, of course," Kelly said, confused. "I've grown very fond of Lisa too." "That's fine," said the man. "Then you will go and take the book to Lisa and agree with her about the day of your visit. I'll go to the accounting department and pay for 10 days of use of this room. Then I'll come down to your room and give you the documents. And Kelly, in keeping with your modesty, if 10 days isn't enough, just give me a call. I'll pay what you need. That's your tip. Remember." There was a smile in the man's voice, a rustle of footsteps, a soft slam. The door, and Lisa was alone again. Overhearing the dialogue stunned her. So this was why her nurse had been so diligent in caring for Lisa as well. She had made a deal with her father that in exchange for caring for the girl, he would let her have a seat in her room. She didn't want her roommate to be a stranger. She basically had a woman lying in the hallway after surgery, and then in a cramped, missing feature than a room. A dozen beds. You have to have some intelligence, sense other people, anticipate their reactions. Our Kelly didn't have that. Ashamed, she recalled her own words. It turns out that the woman she thought was an ignorant orderly has access to not only intelligence and empathy, but also savvy and decency, and the ability to make a quick decision and compassion, simple human compassion. Turns out it doesn't just extend to cats. The blessed one called her Cindy. No, not blessed. Just a normal person who managed in all his ordeal to preserve purity of soul and true nobility, and not lose sympathy for others. God, what a shame she didn't see it sooner. Miranda, we're having a celebratory dinner in honor of your discharge tomorrow. Steamed fish, Kelly announced solemnly, pulling mine from the refrigerator. Bracker pretended to be frightened. The nurse laughed, followed by her ward. I'm going to splurge on a hump for something like this, Kelly announced. And my cats are eating now. Rain's daughter-in-law said that sniff my jam twice a week. She does not agree and buys them pollock. Oh, I'm afraid they'll turn their noses up at my cheap fish later. Why don't you buy fish from wholesale bazaars? Miranda asked, chewing on a steamed gorbushka with pleasure. After all, it's cheaper there than in the stores. You could afford pollock for the same money. But you have to go. It's hard for me. And it's far away. Would you order from Cindy? Bracker suggested it. She and her husband often go there, take orders from neighbors, bring what they need. What kind of savings is that? Kelly laughed. She offered to bring me a box of hams once. But I said yes, and when I brought it to her, she charged me so much at the nearest market. It's cheaper to get it, she said, for the delivery and the time saved. What did you want? I didn't want it that way. I refused. I had to buy those hams from her. I said, eat them yourself. She didn't offer any more. Miranda asked the nurse for the price of her food and was surprised to hear the same amount that she herself always paid to her neighbor. It was just that Bracker did not go to the market, considering it a place that was not very suitable for herself, preferring to store in stores, and to find out how much a box brought to her at the base cost, and even to check the information from Cindy, simply did not occur to her. So the nimble neighbor shamelessly used it. So much for the old guard. So much for being the senior researcher, wife of an academic. And it became disgusting. Of course, she will not clarify relations with her friend, but she will stop ordering her shopping. It's certainly not out of greed, but out of unwillingness to face her dishonesty once again. Having made such a decision, Miranda was a little surprised at herself a month ago. Having received such information, she would hardly have made such a conclusion. On the contrary, she would have justified this Cindy, thinking that the delivery and the time saved were really worth the money, that cooperation with her neighbor should be beneficial to both of them, and something along those lines. About the same way she constantly justified Christina, for example. But now, after all the worries of the last month, Bracker was determined to accept the truth about people, no matter how unpleasant it seemed, and adjust her behavior with those people accordingly. She didn't have much life left to waste on those who hated or neglected her. The discharge was brought to them around noon. By this time, their things were packed. The ward was tidied up. Miranda had washed and listened to her head and changed into a dress and shoes brought to her by a neighbor from home. She was fully prepared to leave the ward. As she walked down the stairs, she wondered aloud how we'd get there, Kelly. There's no direct bus from here, so we'd have to change buses. What bus, Miranda? The neighbor laughed. There's a car waiting. She opened the hospital doors for the woman and stunned. Bracker saw a huge black Jeep at the hospital porch, spreading diesel aromas around it from behind the wheel. Smiling welcomingly in all 32 teeth was a shaven-headed thug. Here, Jacob agreed to help, Kelly said in a satisfied tone, and pulled her stunned neighbor along with her. The thug, identified as Jacob, jumped out of the car, said hello to the women, and gallantly opened the door of the Jeep. He helped Miranda into the back seat and informed her you can ride, even lying down if you have to. The size allows. So don't be shy. Bracker regarded the interior with interest. Surprisingly, inside there was no smell of fuel at all. There was a pleasant coolness and a light fragrance of expensive cologne. Throwing a glance through the windows, Miranda marveled at the height of the Jeep. People on the sidewalks were hardly visible. How do you spot pedestrians? Jacob, she asked. With difficulty, the bandit laughed. Settles Kelly in the front seat. If they're in front of the car, there's a chance you'll see them. If they come from the side, I just can't see them when they pull out of somewhere. I try to honk so some Owen doesn't get under my wheels. But mostly pedestrians notice me and jump in time. This behemoth was hard to miss. He patted the steering wheel of the car with a satisfied grin. All right, everybody ready to go. All the way up the road, the bandit. Jacob was having a lively conversation with Kelly. It turned out that the bandit had a thoroughbred cat, Armor, Shell with a very complex character. Jacob and his family long agonized with the animal, not understanding how to raise it. But the former nurse managed to give the bandit some advice. So with her suggestion, Jacob changed the guild brand fill and sip, and puddles in inappropriate places stopped. The family acquired several as a flower and climbed, so that the cat had a place to splash out energy and not to ruin the atmosphere in the apartment. Vrumtel began to take out for walks in crooks and feed about groves. Because of what stopped cat attacks on indoor flowers and open pots are a thing of the past. Well, and something else on the little things. Miranda did not remember all the subtleties of raising cats because at some point she felt worse. She was shaking as the road began to whimper, the stitches that had seemed to come alive. And part of the conversation was left unattended by her. Toward the end of the trip, the woman still decided to take Jacob's permission and lay back in the seat. But when the Jeep stopped, she thought with horror that now she would have to get up and scramble out of the high interior. There was practically no strength to do so. Jacob opened the door from the outside, looked into the back seat, and then somehow deftly picked Miranda up on his arm and took her out of the cabin and carried her to the entrance. "Permission, madam," he said gallantly as he groomed you a little. "For a long time, I have not carried such graceful and slender women in my arms. You should have your spouse violent in the arsenal be," responded indignant Miranda. "Kelly, put the bags down. Now we will deliver your ward, and I'll go down for them," Jacob said sternly. "Go ahead and open the doors." Then he leaned slightly toward Bracker and said mockingly, "Alas, the last time I carried my wife in my arms was on our wedding day. And even then she was noticeably heavier. I must confess. And now she's all overgrown. She's a busy lady now. I'd say she's monumental. I can only hold her in my arms, but I don't have the health for that. But you'd be nice to carry her, wouldn't you? You wouldn't deny me a little pleasure." Unexpectedly for myself. Bracker laughed heartily and lightly. Quite nice this Jacob, it turns out, is not such a bandit. The neighbors brought Miranda into the apartment, laid her on the couch and carried her bags. Kelly spent some time talking about what was on what shelf in the refrigerator and what should be eaten first. It turned out that she had once had time to cook with a reserve of diet food to comply with the new Bracker diet regime and had about half a year to go at least. Finally, the counselors dispersed and Miranda was left alone. She kicked off her shoes, stretched out on the couch and covered her eyes. The apartment was quiet. No one came from the body next to the book pages fiddling on the next bed. Did not step slippers, did not talk in whispers of nonsense. It had been an awfully long time since the woman had been alone indoors, and it suddenly became clear that it wasn't so pleasant. It would be nice to have someone around right now. Bracker suddenly thought. Even a cat. Miranda was coming back from the store. The bag was pulling her arm back pleasantly, even though she was forbidden to carry heavy things. After the surgery, the woman decided that 2 kilograms would do no harm. Approaching the turn into the yard, she cautiously peeked into the passage and, making sure that the way was free, boldly walked on the asphalt. As she exited the house, she had seen Jacob's Jeep in the parking lot by the driveway, and now feared she would collide with it. As she drove out of the yard, she already knew that the driver wouldn't be able to see her, and at the same time she realized that she wouldn't be able to gracefully jump the curb when operation she couldn't yet. Practice later, of course. But for now, it was better to take preventive measures and make sure the path was clear. Miranda heard a familiar voice. "But at last you've come back to her." Cindy moved through the square, her whole demeanor expressing her joy at her neighbor's return. "Did I see you brought home yesterday?" That gate marshal said yes. I can't believe our blessed lady talked him into it. I told her to do it as a joke. You advised her. Excuse me, Miranda. Oh yes. Cindy started explaining. She came to me first to look for a car for a drink, because it's not convenient to get there by transport after such an operation. There's no direct routes. It's exhausting and it's risky. Someone in the crowd could push Pasha into the car. She knows we have a car. So what are you interested in? Miranda asked. Oh, you know our car. It's just a name. The neighbor waved her hand. It's old and falling apart. And that way where your hospital was. The road's there, pothole upon pothole, not maintained at all. We'd leave the whole suspension on them. And repairs aren't cheap these days. I jokingly told her that only Jeeps should drive on those roads. They're not afraid of anything. They can go anywhere. Try, I said, to attract our Jeep. But I'm joking. But she's really joking. But at least you've ridden in a Jeep. How was it? Wasn't it scary? Miranda answered in a moderately restrained manner. Did I see him carrying you out of the car yesterday? He was waiting for you at 12 o'clock. Yes. Why didn't you come in? Bracker asked. I just thought you might want to clean up after the hospital. Get yourself cleaned up. And again, the apartment is not cleaned and stood for a month code in such a situation to ask for a visit, only to embarrass the owners. To Territorkin Cindy. Miranda nodded her head. She hadn't even thought about the condition of the apartment. Only now she realized that the ubiquitous Kelly had somehow managed to clean it before she was discharged. At least there was no lingering dust, no small debris on the floor, no musty atmosphere. She did not detect the mustiness that inevitably appears in rooms that have been standing for even a couple of weeks without airing. Oh, here comes our blessed one. Cindy exclaimed softly and pointed with her hand in the direction. From around the corner, the neighbor did indeed emerge, carrying her usual bag and 3 cats, surrounded by 3 differently shaped cats. Miranda, without saying goodbye to her food, hurried to meet her. Kelly. Good morning. And you know, I had such good luck at the fish store today. I bought a couple pounds of pollock for your ward. Hopefully enough for 1 meal.